Welcome to The Prescription, the Tax Policy Center's biweekly webcast on fiscal policy. This is one of a series of conversations with state, local, and federal government officials, as well as leading economists and other experts. I'm your host, Howard Gleckman, a senior fellow at TPC and editor of our blog, TaxVox. My guest today is Brooklyn Law School Professor Stephen Dean. Professor Dean has written extensively on race and taxes and has co-authored 3 books on a wide variety of topics. He serves on the board of the National Tax Association and is a member of the Diversity Committee of the American Bar Association's tax section. And he's a member of the editorial board for its journal, The Tax Lawyer. Professor Dean previously was vice dean at Brooklyn Law School, and before that, visiting law professor at NYU and faculty director of its graduate tax program. Before becoming an academic, he practiced corporate tax law with firms in New York. He has his law degree from Yale. Before we begin, our usual bit of housekeeping. We encourage audience members to submit questions in the Q&A box at the bottom of your screen. The event's being recorded and will be posted online at TPC's website. We're using captioning, which you can adjust or turn off with the live transcript button at the bottom of your Zoom screen. And if you'd like to join the conversation on social media, please use the hashtag #LiveAtUrban. If you'd like to suggest a future guest for The Prescription, just email us at info@taxpolicycenter.org. Stephen Dean, welcome to The Prescription.
Thank you so much, Howard. It's great to be here today.
It's great to have you. So as I mentioned in the introduction, your early career was in international corporate tax, but you changed your focus to the effects of tax law on Black people in the United States. So why did you make that change?
So there's a strange, if natural, transition from the one to the other. So I grew up in a tax haven. I grew up in the Bahamas. My mom is from Fargo, of all places, but my dad is from the Bahamas. We grew up in the Bahamas. And when I went to law school, it was around the time that the OECD had launched its effort to crack down on harmful tax practices. And I was aware at the time and was perplexed by their fixation on countries like the Bahamas, which I knew were not really doing a great job. But as I like to say, if you think the Bahamas has ruined your global tax system, you've got a pretty terrible global tax system. Because I grew up and we would sometimes lose power for one summer. I think we lost power the entire summer. My mom would get up in the middle of the night to do laundry when power would come on briefly. So if this is somebody you think is, taking over the world, you're a little confused. So, I wrote about that for a while. I wrote what I thought was pretty reasonable kind of work, suggesting that, for example, if you want the cooperation of these small, often relatively poor countries to collect billions of dollars in revenue, one thing you might at least want to consider is sharing that with them. So if you say, hey, Bahamas, we need to collect $70 billion in revenue. You guys have a GDP that's a tiny fraction of that. Why don't we make an arrangement for, 5-10 years? You'll get some portion of that. And after that, you have to figure out something else. The response to that I got was really quite odd. The response I got to that proposal was really quite odd, and to all of my writing about tax havens. And it took me, quite honestly, I stopped writing about tax havens for about a decade. I moved on to other work related to social enterprise and all sorts of philanthropy. And just recently, about 2 years ago, after my time at NYU, came back to writing about tax, and it was really during that period that I realized that the missing piece, what was really driving a lot of the hostility towards tax havens was race. If you look at the list of tax havens that the OECD identified in 2000, it features one country that really, for personal reasons, stood out to me. It featured Liberia. It did not feature Switzerland. And I happen to know, unlike most tax lawyers, what Liberia in that period around 2000 looked like. I had had an asylum client from Liberia who had fled the incredibly brutal civil war that had taken over the country for years, was, I like to say, it's a place that no OECD resident would ever put something they wanted to see again. So the idea that the OECD would actually try to impose sanctions on Liberia for what was probably the only crime its government was not currently committing really did strike me. And it occurred. I eventually realized that part of what was driving the distorting the global tax policymaking process was race. And the response I got to trying to gently speak out about this was really strong and really negative. And I realized this was not something that I could speak quietly about, but I had to speak loudly about. And the more I've spoken out about it, the more resistance I've seen. And being a little cantankerous, I find that when somebody tells me that something that is pretty obviously, at least partly true, is entirely false, I'm not going to shut up.
So you recently wrote a paper describing three situations where you found that race affected the application of tax law. One involved the artist Sam Gilliam. One, as you just noted, was about international tax havens. And a third focused on the death of Eric Garner, the man who died after being put in a police chokehold when he was arrested for allegedly selling cigarettes without tax stamps. So briefly, if you can, tell us what those stories told you about race and taxes. I think you told us a little bit about the Liberia story, but more broadly, what did it say about race and taxes in the US?
Yeah, that's a great question. I appreciate that. That paper, follows on one that I wrote about a year ago with a colleague, Atia Warris from Nairobi, 10 Truths About Tax Havens. And, both pieces are ones that I honestly never thought I would write, mostly because I didn't think I needed to, but also because it's not really something that is part of it's not really the way I think about myself. I don't really think of myself as an activist in that way, or I didn't. I think I do now. So that's changed. But what I've learned and what I'm really trying to communicate is not something very complicated. There are a lot of scholars out there who've made a really complex series of insights about race and tax available. Dorothy Brown being notable, for example, her book, The Whiteness of Wealth. These are people who've thought deeply and for a long time about race and tax. I have not. I've thought long enough about it to realize that it may not be, it's not 100% of the problem. It may not even be 50% of the problem. It may not even be 10% of the problem, but it's not 0% of the problem. And for example, the story of the Sam Gilliam incident that I talk about in the article is, I think, telling. So Sam Gilliam is now an incredibly famous, one of the most famous American artists. But back in the 1980s, he was a well-known artist, professional artist who gave big exhibits at the Philadelphia Museum of Art, for example, and had been traveling to give a presentation somewhere in the country. I don't remember where he was going. And he was traveling and he suffered from, I think, anxiety or another condition like that. He called his doctor to get a new prescription for the trip, acting very responsibly. And unfortunately, the prescription that he got from his doctor did not help, in fact, hurt. And there was an incident on the plane. And so, he injured another passenger. We don't really know the circumstances very clearly, but another passenger was injured. He ended up being arrested. And he tried to take deductions for the legal costs of that incident. And he was not able to do that. So for years, this case is reproduced in many textbooks, many federal income tax, the basic tax law textbook. So he he tried to take those deductions and was not allowed to. And the case discusses that, which is why it's reproduced in many textbooks. It's very interesting, notable that this person didn't get to take these deductions while other people, somebody who's accused of sexual assault, somebody who was convicted of securities fraud was allowed to deduct these expenses, but this person was not allowed to. And one textbook, the one I used, suggested it might have been because he's an artist and aren't artists treated unfairly. But what strikes me now, in retrospect, having learned by accident, my wife is an art historian, and somebody she shared an office with had done his dissertation on Sam Gilliam. So I happened to hear a lot about Sam Gilliam, and I was like, that's quite a coincidence. There'd be two, no, of course, it was the same Sam Gilliam. And that's how I found out he was a Black artist. And knowing that fact just changed everything for me. I mean, to imagine all that we now know, and now we know a lot more than we did then, imagining how healthcare disparities may have impacted Sam Gilliam. Was he getting good healthcare from his doctor? I don't know. I mean, we wonder about these things. when he was arrested on the plane. Did that have anything to do with race? I, I don't think we can rule out conclusively that it was not a factor. His interactions with the passengers and the crew, who knows? Who knows what they made of Sam Gilliam, this brilliant artist who seemed to be misunderstood on the plane. And I'll be very honest. When I learned about this, I'm a quiet guy. So when I learned about all this, my instinct was to very quietly approach the textbook authors that I had known for years, and I worked with them, and there's no reason to make a ruckus about this. So I approached one of them over lunch and said, I told the story and said, I just happen to know this. I think it'd be great if this could be dealt with. And the response I got was, no, I don't think that's important. I don't think that's relevant. And I said to myself, I don't think you get to decide that for all law students in the country. I think it's part of your responsibility as a textbook author to raise these questions, not answer them, but to allow that conversation to happen in classrooms throughout the country. And what that story, what the Eric Garner story to me suggests, we often think about the IRS as the country's largest tax and law enforcement agency, right? Depending on how you measure it, it's a really big law enforcement agency. And to suggest that there's zero racism there is absurd. I mean, it's absurd. I'm not sure, how big a problem it is. But, how do I know there's a problem? When I published a letter to the editor in Tax Notes related to this Filing While Black article, the reason I knew it got posted is not because I got anything from Tax Notes, it's because I got a nasty racist hate mail instantly, telling me that what I had written was disgusting, and that blacks essentially were all crooks and they deserved whatever the IRS did to them. So this was not a casual reader of Tax Notes. This was a Tax Notes superfan who went out of his way to email me right away. This is to me an indication that there may be something worth thinking about here.
So I have to ask you, Professor Dean, having surfaced this issue of Sam Gilliam and the fact that the textbooks ignored his race, has that changed? Are the textbooks now?
So it has changed. It has changed, and I'm happy to note that I don't know if I'm happy about it. So what happened was one textbook author died. I didn't do it. It wasn't my fault. And they hired a new younger co-author, and that new younger co-author heard me presenting about this and said, "Oh, we got to fix this." So, I think they're now working on it. But I certainly it makes me happy that they brought in a new co-author who was open to hearing this in the way that the existing co-authors had not been. But it shouldn't take that. I'm not looking for people to die to start addressing this, and I don't think that's necessary. I'm certainly willing to keep speaking out. I don't think the things I'm saying are especially radical or even particularly interesting. I find it not particularly interesting to suggest that we should all wonder why not only did the OECD identify Liberia as a tax haven and not Switzerland 20 years ago, but why there's never been any accountability for that. I've never heard anything like an explanation. I was at the NTA a few weeks ago, National Tax Association a few weeks ago, and I saw somebody put up a chart that they had based on that 2000 list of tax havens, including Liberia. And if we're not going to talk about it, we're going to keep making those mistakes, unfortunately.
So I want to ask you I think a kind of an interesting sort of nuanced question about this. Is your concern about tax law that discriminates by race within income groups, or that it discriminates by race because it disadvantages low-income taxpayers who are disproportionately Black or other minorities? So
I will say that, and this is where I differ from maybe more thoughtful colleagues like Dorothy Brown and others. I don't really have a view. I don't really have a strong view on what role race plays on the tax law. I don't know. All I know is, so I know for a fact that it's had a pernicious effect in the academic community, in the classroom. That's what I know, right? That's what I know that for sure. I know that the OECD's 2000 list, listing Liberia, but not Switzerland, to this day has harmful impacts on countries and on the global tax policy making process. I know that. Do I think that it has a sort of a specifically racially regressive impact? It certainly does when you look at the work, say, ProPublica has done on the high audit rates that apply in low-income, predominantly Black counties in the South. It just has to be true that there are vulnerable Black people being targeted by tax authorities. I mean, is it one a year? I don't know. Is it 100? Is it 1,000? It's not zero. It's just not. It just can't be zero. And that nasty email I got from a tax notes reader assures me that that is true. There must be some of it, and I suspect it hits the most vulnerable the most. But it's important to remember that it affects everybody, right? It affects everybody, and I like to note, and Howard, you know the answer to this question, so I won't trick you with this one. So Senator Tim Scott, the Black Republican senator, was pulled over 7 times in 1 year in his car. I don't know when in his career this was, and maybe he's a little more prosperous now than he was when this happened, but that affects him. That affects Tim Scott. I mean, that's driving while Black. And I don't know why we think filing while Black doesn't affect anybody. So does it affect wealthy Black taxpayers? Certainly I remember when I first started teaching every year for quite a while, the IRS had a lot of fun publicizing its work with Wesley Snipes, who had done, just sort of foolish tax evasion kind of work. But was that, all this makes me wonder now. One of the only hedge fund billionaires who's been fingered for tax evasion was Black. I don't know, but what's more important, so I guess 2 things. There must be some out there, right? There must be some impact. Of course, it's more likely to fall heaviest on those who are the most vulnerable. I don't deny that at all. That's almost certainly true. But it probably affects everybody, or it could affect everybody. And we should want to know that. I'll just mention that when the recent GAO report came out about race and tax and the lack of tax data, this is something I think was a really positive step that they did this. But what was most disappointing about the report, and here I'm quoting Dorothy Brown, she noted that the GAO explained that one of the reasons that the IRS can't collect this tax data, this race data, is that they can only collect data that is related to effective tax administration. And as she pointed out, it must be related to good tax administration if a former IRS employee can team up with ProPublica and show that the 5 highest audit rates are in poor Black counties in the South. That is not good tax administration. And if we don't have the information, or if we're blinding ourselves to the information so that a former IRS employee can do this, but the IRS itself is not able to do this, that's kind of strange, right? Somebody with no resources can do this, but the largest law enforcement agency in the country can't do it for some reason. To suggest that this is not related to good tax administration, that's really troubling to me. If we did that in any other area, I remember in law school, one of the cases we read early on was a case about the death penalty. And there was a very careful study that showed that the death penalty was applied disproportionately by race, by any measures, grossly misapplied by race. And the Supreme Court said, well, that may be true, but we can't so for sure that it affected this particular person on death row, so we don't care about it. And I feel like I'm hearing the same sort of thing from tax authorities now, that sure, we probably know that race is relevant here, but it can't be related to good tax administration because I'm not really sure why. So we're not going to bother with it now. And that to me is really quite troubling.
So let's go back one step before we talk about tax administration. Let's talk about tax policy. So you titled your paper "Filing While Black: The Casual Racism of Tax Law," and that word "casual" was really interesting to me. So in this case, in your mind, does casual mean unintentional, or do you think that Congress explicitly wrote tax laws that discriminate against Black people?
So what I mean by casual is, uh, and I think there's something strange about the way tax deals with this now. And to me, it feels like a throwback. It feels like a throwback to an era where, sure, we just understood that we're racist people, and it was, we didn't like it, but we'll accept it because what are you going to do? People have these crazy views, and we're willing to tolerate it. So, and I think others are willing to, embrace, say, sure, when the OECD includes a picture of a palm tree when it's describing Switzerland as one of its tax havens, it did this in its brochure last year. You can take a look at it. There's the actual palm tree in its description of Pillar 2 when it's focusing on other countries. I'm not making this up. And we say, well, that's okay. It doesn't really matter. One of the moments when I really lost my temper was when Biden, in announcing Build Back Better, used as an example of the countries that were basically going to pay for our roads, the Caymans and Bermuda. And his experts all know that Switzerland belonged on that list. But hey, it's good politics to mention majority Black countries. So we're just going to do that. And everybody's kind of okay with it. And I don't understand how in 2022, this is 2021 to be fair, we can just accept that and say, oh, nobody really meant that. We know better, but it's okay. People love that red meat stuff, so it's just going to be fine. And to me, that's what really I find incredible. There's not sort of a grudging acceptance that there is a problem that we need to deal with. It's just sort of a casual acceptance of racism as being part of the work that tax lawyers and tax policymakers and tax experts do. A casual acceptance of it that I find incredibly troubling.
So you had a very powerful sentence. You said that racial bias has been, the quote, is long tolerated and sometimes exploited by tax scholars and policymakers. So let's leave aside the policymakers for a second. What do you mean when you say that tax scholars have exploited racial bias?
Sure. So I can think of the most obvious area is in the tax haven context. I think a lot of scholars, I remember one, very thoughtful historian who titled the book about tax evasion and tax havens, Archipelago Capitalism. And I don't think, this is a very smart person. I don't think that they would have used that trope if they had understood the racial subtext. But I also think that it's not an accident. I think that the OECD has really got a lot of benefit from this narrative of white victimhood that it created in 2000 and has perpetrated through this trope and the meme of the palm tree. And so that's really something that it has done. But scholars who love writing about tax havens, this person that was presenting at the National Tax Association just a few weeks ago, they don't quite know why everybody likes their work a little bit more when they throw Liberia in there, but they do, and I don't really understand. No, that's not true. I'm not gonna lie to you, Howard. I understand why people do it, but I'm not gonna stand for it. I'm not gonna be polite about it anymore.
Well, so it's an interesting question, right? So why do they? Do they do it because they're racist? Do they do it because they're lazy? Why
No, I think do I think that whoever is using there's a great example. So in the week, Popular News magazine, I think it was last year around the same time, they published an essay about Pillar 2, about the global minimum tax, and it was, illustrated with sort of a drawing of Bermuda, a map of Bermuda, and it had a giant image of Yellen looming over Bermuda. And there was a line in that I'm not going to try to quote because I won't get it right, but essentially said, why don't we just we can impose sanctions or just invade these countries? They're tiny, because of course we all think that we're led to believe that we're talking about Bermuda and not about Switzerland. I don't think we want to invade Switzerland anytime soon, but there is a sense that it's just so easy and appealing, this sort of resort to violence that comes so easily when you're talking about majority Black countries, small defenseless majority Black countries. It's just so, that narrative of white victimhood. I don't think you have to be a racist to be affected by that, to find power in that. And certainly, if you understand that, people download your articles more when you mention Bermuda than when you mention Switzerland, and you really don't think about it. I asked one, incredibly thoughtful scholar about the way people think about tax. I was very curious what they would say. There was a question they had asked people, how strongly do you feel about tax havens like Bermuda and the Cayman Islands? And I asked them, do you think it matters that you use those examples? And they said, no, people just hate tax havens. People just really respond. And I thought to myself, your whole job, the thing that made you famous is asking people about how they feel about things and think about things, and to just not even be willing to really think too hard or question the role that, is it implicit bias? I don't know. Is it just the power of a white victimhood narrative without really tapping into anybody's conscious racism? Listen, and one of the reasons that I'm really bad at this, and one of the reasons it took me decades to really decide this was an issue, my mom is a white lady from Fargo, North Dakota. I grew up in the Bahamas, and the strange thing about me was that I had a white mom. I just, it took me a long time to come to grips with the idea that in this space, and again, I mentioned Dorothy Brown yet again. I think I did at least 3 times now. She said that the reason she chose tax was that, having grown up as a Black person in the U.S., she was tired of talking about race, and she wanted to talk about tax. You want to work in tax because the only color that mattered there was green. And it's taken me. I'm coming at it from the other direction, and it's taken me a long time to get there. But I now see that it's true that there's at least a conversation to be had, and we're not having it, and that I find frustrating. I don't have a clear answer about what the problems are and how to fix them. But I do know that and this is why I love that we're talking about this now in this space with a lot of people who are not pointy-headed academics like me, but are out there doing the real work. But just, it's time to have that conversation. In housing, right? They don't have perfect data on racism in housing. So people send out housing testers, right? And they just, send out a Black person and a white person to apply for an apartment. And lo and behold, even though nobody's saying anything racist, the Black person gets told there are no apartments and the white person gets told there are apartments. There are ways to have this conversation. There are ways to learn about what's happening that don't necessarily require the perfect data that I think is often the goal of well-intentioned people. And I think we should get that data, but I don't think we need that data to have a conversation.
Stephen Dean, this has been a fascinating conversation. I wish we could go on for another half an hour. Maybe we can find a way to get you back. Thank you so much for taking the time to chat with us, and thanks to our audience for listening. It's a very important.
Thank you so much, Howard.
Going to continue. Thank you.